It shouldn't be this difficult. You're not going to lunch until I'm done. Okay, everybody, shut it. I'm really starting now. Sarah, can you keep it down? Okay, good. Chapter 11, the Jeffersonian Republic. The live cast of Chapter 11. So when we look at the election of 1800, we have the Federalists putting forward John Adams for re-election versus Thomas Jefferson. And they had created their own challenges by passing the Alien and Sedition Acts, by spending a lot of spending a lot of money to prepare for war. They created debt and had to pass new taxes. This led to Jefferson gaining a lot of power, especially with those frontier farmers who supported his view for what the nation should become. The Federalists tried to focus on slandering Jefferson. If you look on your outline, you can see some quotes from articles written by James Callender, slamming John Adams and Jefferson alike. So Jefferson, despite all these challenges and his deist faith, led to his victory. Without the 3/5 clause, however, he would not have been able to win, but that by counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, he's able to defeat through the support of the South and the West. An interesting situation occurs in this election, however, because Aaron Burr and Jefferson actually tie. That's because of an outdated way of doing things in which the second place person in the election was supposed to be vice president. But if there was a tie, then you had to have a runoff. So without organized political parties and someone not throwing their vote away for Aaron Burr, they instead have to have a runoff. So after 36 ballots in the House of Representatives, and as the Hamilton musical shows, Federalists choosing to side with Jefferson, including Hamilton, Jefferson is able to become president, and Aaron Burr is his vice president. So the reason why this election is often called the Revolution of 1800 is because there was a peaceful transition of power from two very different political parties. As you saw on the chart from Chapter 10, Federalists and Democratic Republicans were quite different from one another. And so the fact that we're able to pass power from John Adams, who was an elitist and a Federalist and wanted a strong central government, as somebody who wanted to limit the power of the federal government and to give that power to the states, it's quite amazing at how easily the power transferred. And so the Revolution of 1800 refers to Jefferson's party taking over and changing how our government was going to be run. Other areas around the world were shocked at just how peaceful this was, because typically in new nations, whenever there's a changeover in power, it's followed by a war. So awesome, and something we can really look at our founding fathers as something they did quite successfully. So when Jefferson takes over, he wants to limit the government as much as he can. And the new Capitol that was in Washington, D.C., which had just been built, represented his approach really well. For the most part, it was a swamp land where Jefferson was settling in, where D.C. was being built. When he gets there, he uses democratic principles across the board. One of the most democratic things he did was he did not allow British and French representatives a special seat at the table. Instead, he allowed everyone to sit wherever they wanted. This offended a lot of people like Federalists and, of course, our British and French ministers. Didn't exactly win over many people in the elitist ranks. However, Jefferson made people who followed him, like the farmers on the frontier, love him even more. As president, one thing that's notable, and this is a direct quote from your textbook, is that he is consistently inconsistent. Many of the principles he swore that he would stand by as president and he claimed were his ideals are things that he does the complete opposite of as president. So that's one major theme of Jefferson, is the fact that he says one thing and does quite another when he is president. And then finally, Jefferson avoids the practice of patronage. He allowed many Federalist officials to keep their jobs. The most famous person to use this will be Andrew Jackson in a future chapter, but it is noble of Jefferson to keep around Federalists who are doing good things rather than just fire everyone like most political parties seem to do. When it comes to the actual actions he takes, Jefferson undid a lot of the Federalist abuses. He pardons those who had been charged under the Sedition Acts for speaking their mind. He repeals the excise tax on whiskey, which made his farmer and frontiermen happy, and he ends the Alien Act's 14-year requirement for immigrants to become citizens. With the new Secretary of Treasury, Albert Gallatin, he also is able to balance the budget. Rather than keeping that national debt that Hamilton believed was good in building credit with other nations, he eliminates it, so we're sitting at par. Most of Hamilton's work, however, was left intact. The bank, the tariff, and funding at par. The bank would be rechartered in the mid-18 teens, and the tariff will be increased throughout these following years. So it's interesting that he keeps that work around. Some would argue it's because of the deal he had to make to win the presidency and those tie-breaking votes of the House of Representatives. Regardless, Jefferson exercised restraint when it came to limiting the federal government's power. So when he saw programs being successful, he kept them. Now, again, this does go against his theory that government should be limited, and allowing the bank and tariff to continue existing shows that he did adapt his ideals as president. This brings us to another big moment in American history, the time when we see the Supreme Court established as the final word on constitutionality. So when John Adams is about to step out, even though the transfer of power was peaceful, he did put in what they called midnight judges. His last night in office, he was furiously signing paperwork appointing lifetime Federalist judges that would be anti-Jeffersonian in their decisions. So although this act was quickly repealed by the new Congress, many of these judges were put into action for lifetime appointments. Next, we see one of our most important founding fathers who probably doesn't get mentioned as much, but he pretty much is the man who single-handedly hands power to the Supreme Court. So John Marshall is the one who shaped our legal tradition more than any other figure in our history. In another chapter, I believe it's chapter 12, we'll look at some more of his decisions that strengthens the power of the federal government over the states. But for now, we'll focus on Marbury versus Madison. In this case, Marbury was denied his ability to become a federal judge when James Madison refused to deliver the paperwork which would have made him a judge. So Marbury sues the government. But when Marshall reviews it as a Supreme Court justice, he says that the appointment actually couldn't happen based upon the 1796 Judicial Act. So what's interesting about this is Madison and Jefferson allow this to stand, even though it was clearly a power grab by the Supreme Court. But the long-lasting principle set in place by this is called judicial review. Both the executive and legislative branches both accepted that the Supreme Court had final word on constitutionality. And today, in 2020, when we see Amy Coney Barrett applying to become a Supreme Court justice, the reason why people care so much is because of the power invested in the Supreme Court that begins with Marbury versus Madison and Supreme Court being given the power of judicial review. So highlighted in green there are the Barbary states, which we have actually already mentioned in this class. When Thomas Jefferson became president, he assumed that he would be able to limit the power of the government by limiting the amount of money we spent on an army and navy. In fact, he wanted to spend as little as possible, only what was necessary for our personal defense. What he found, however, is peaceful coercion doesn't work with people who, well, don't respect peace and kindness. And so in North Africa, those Barbary pirates began to ruin his plans for peaceful negotiations. North African pirates plundered American ships, ruining our shipping economy in the Mediterranean and to many of the African and European nations. So Thomas Jefferson is forced to go against his ideals, and he is forced to not only create an army, but also a navy capable of protecting our shipping in those areas. So one of our very first battles is fought under Thomas Jefferson at Tripoli, there you see on the map. And when we send troops over there to fight, we were able to forge a peace treaty with those pirates, paying $60,000 for the American captives. Jefferson also builds 200 gunboats, although these weren't really large-scale warships. Most people mockingly called them mosquito fleets because they were basically the size of mosquitoes compared to actual ships. Regardless, Jefferson, in building those boats and sending the military to Africa to fight the Barbary pirates, shows that he had to recognize the need for military spending to protect our nation's interests. So once again, going against those values that he had held before he was president. So one of the biggest successes of Jefferson's presidency is the Louisiana Purchase, and he fell into it quite accidentally. France had recently gained control of ownership of New Orleans from Spain, and Jefferson knew this city was key for U.S. farmers. Without it, they had no way to ship their crops to the east. They would need to go down the Mississippi River and then through the Gulf of Mexico could find their way to market. In 1803, Jefferson sent James Monroe to negotiate with the French. Now remember, we had been having some war issues with the French up to this point, so we're not really sure whether they're going to be willing to negotiate or not. When James Monroe arrives there and offers $10 million just for the city, Napoleon instead offers $15 million for the entire Louisiana Purchase. So James Monroe, naturally, with $5 million more to purchase all that land, decides to go ahead and agree to it. The problem with this is Jefferson agrees to sign it into action, but ironically, this is actually against his constitutional powers. Jefferson is actually overstepping the bounds the Constitution gives him. So what's interesting is you see not only him using his power as president to create a larger military, he even breaks his strict interpretationist approach to purchase it. Now, I don't think anybody would argue with those ideas. The Senate approves, and we do purchase all this land. But it does show that his inflexible, strict interpretation was not necessarily practical. So here you have a couple of passages. You have Louisiana Purchase, and then you have Lewis and Clark exploring out west. You also have Pike exploring the southern territories, even going into New Spain in that time period. But you can see that the land bought by the Louisiana Purchase was worth more than 15 million by far, and expands, basically doubling our territory. So more land, more problems. As we gain more land, it does create some issues politically. Louisiana Purchase was quite beneficial for future expansion. The farmers and frontiersmen who supported Jefferson were thrilled by this new addition to our land. However, Federalists were terrified of what this would do to their party. As the population moved further west, Federalists on the coast and in those urban areas knew that power was draining away from them. And so what they decided to do is create a plot. So the current sitting vice president, Aaron Burr, who was not at all getting along with Jefferson, he decides to run for governor of New York at the end of his term. He was part of a Federalist plot to possibly secede from the U.S. Federalists thought that if Aaron Burr could win the governorship, they could combine New York with New England, and then they would secede, creating their own country. So, unfortunately for Aaron Burr, and maybe fortunately for America, Alexander Hamilton re-enters the fray of the political world, and he defames Burr, saying that he has no morals and he couldn't be trusted. And so Burr loses that election. Now, unlike the musical in which it's about the election of 1800, it's actually this governor's election that leads to their duel, causing Burr to challenge him for the mean words he had said. And when Hamilton refuses to apologize, they have a duel and Hamilton is killed. So imagine having a vice president, imagine currently Mike Pence deciding to murder a political opponent. And then just imagine the political upheaval that would occur. That's the same thing that happened with Burr. His career was ended, and although he attempted a second secession in the South, he was found not guilty of treason. So Aaron Burr, clearly not a good man, but the whole point of this is seeing that Federalists saw the political future of the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson and later Madison and Monroe. They saw power draining and going towards those parties, leaving the Federalists behind. So getting into international affairs, Jefferson found neutrality difficult. The war between Britain and France continued to escalate in 1805, with both sides ordering a seizure of all ships headed to the enemy. So rather than try to get America on their side, they instead both began harassing us. So the worst of all these things was the British practice of impressment. What they would do is they would board American ships and take those sailors and force them into service in their navy. This naturally made a lot of Americans angry, as their natural right of a citizen of America meant that they shouldn't have to serve in their navy. But so Britain continued to do this, with the most famous affair being the Chesapeake affair, when they actually fired upon a ship that wouldn't let them land and stole several men from that ship. Luckily, Congress is at recess at this time, so no war was declared, but we came very close to war. So how can we handle these issues between Britain and France? How can we keep peace between the two sides or make them bow to our will? Thomas Jefferson makes one of the biggest mistakes a president makes, at least economically speaking. He believed that he could solve the tension by passing what he called the Embargo Act of 1807. Basically, we thought we could forbid all export of U.S. goods with the thought that France and Britain recognized that they relied on us so much. In other words, the British economy relied upon our goods. The phone call, and man, this happens when you live cast it. The French and British recognize how much they rely on our goods, but unfortunately, France and Britain just went to trade elsewhere. And so America ruins its own economy trying to teach Britain and France a lesson. So, well, he's left crushing our own economy. His own party abandons him. Congress, dominated by Democratic Republicans, repeal this Embargo Act. It only encourages illegal trade, and it even revives the dying Federalist Party. So Thomas Jefferson's decision to shut down our economy in order to try to force France and Britain to bow down to us backfired. And then we have the Non-Intercourse Act. So what we recognize in the following year is that maybe we can just cut off trade to Britain and France. But that, again, does not really shape up in our favor. This cartoon is ridiculous. Attendance. Hello? She is. She'll be right there. Bye. Awesome. This is going on YouTube. All right, so Madison takes office, makes mistakes. What James Madison does is he takes office in 1809, and he sees that the Non-Intercourse Act, where we're not trading with Britain or France, is set to expire. So what he decides is to make a deal that says if either France or Britain agrees to trade with us, we will not trade with the other one. So Britain figures, well, what does it matter? Your shipping doesn't threaten us, and France can't trade with you anyway. And so America is forced to, agree with the French that they won't trade with the British. Basically, all this combines to ruin American trading internationally. Now, the one positive in the long term, as you'll see at the bottom here, the blocking of our ports and the ending of our international trade is the complete opposite of what Thomas Jefferson would have wanted. As he wanted an agrarian, agricultural, farmer-based economy, his shutting down of the ports forced us to create our own manufactured products. So Thomas Jefferson is the one who really gives life to New England manufacturing because he cuts us off from trade with the British. Anyway, long term here, we then have growing conflict with Britain, who continues to harass our shipping. As when a new wave of congressmen in 1811 joined, they are called the War Hawks, men like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay from the frontier. One of the major things they wanted to do was to defeat the Indian threat. They were tired of Native Americans attacking their families out west. And so this is combined with the threat given to America by Tecumseh and the Prophet, two Shawnee brothers. Their plan was to push back against American expansion by combining many of the Native American tribes out west and together pushing us out of their area. They also had British support, and so they were very dangerous to those settlers. Americans counter by sending future President William Henry Harrison out west to attack while Tecumseh is out rallying other tribes. And at the Battle of Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison is able to burn down Prophetstown. The prophet escapes with his life, but it does discredit his I guess what he had built up, his religious persona, that people had faith that he was going to deliver them along with the help of the great spirits. So after the defeat of Tecumseh and his brother at Tippecanoe, Tecumseh is forced to join the British and will be fighting them again in the War of 1812. So finally, with all this said, we have all this growing conflict over the last two chapters between ourselves and France. France decides to side with us, even though they couldn't trade with us, and that causes us to have only Britain left as our enemy. So James Madison, as president, decides to go to war. He's pushed by the war hawks in Congress. He's tired of Indian aggression on the frontier, and there was a belief that we would inevitably have to fight. After all, they're not respecting American independence. The only way to make sure that it is respected is to fight for it. So James Madison hoped that this war would restore faith in the Republican experiment, restore faith in our government and in our country and what our ideals were. And he also believed this would solidify our independence. No surprise that Federalists did not really like this plan because they wanted to reestablish trade with the British to make money. But because the Democratic Republicans made up a majority in Congress and all the political power, we vote to go to war with them. It may not surprise you that if a war begins with your nation divided by region and by party, it's probably not going to turn out very well. So this chapter was all about the Jeffersonian period, ushering in a new wave of politicians and ideas into the central government. We see mistakes made by Jefferson that are the opposite of what his ideals were, but we also see some positives come from his decisions as well. So chapter 12 will be all about the War of 1812. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the attendance office interrupting the lecture. Have a great day. Like and subscribe. Was that good? That was good. So good.